Welcome to episode 18 of the International Web Effectiveness Podcast, where Bill Hunt and I, Bill Scully, focus on the strategies and techniques necessary to improve your web presence and manage your global websites. In our last episode, we recapped Brighton SEO San Diego and discussed some of the key presentations that covered using AI in your workflows, search journeys, and branded keyword theories. There are a lot of valuable nuggets and interesting conversations in that one. So check that out. It's episode 17 if you're interested. In this episode, we attempt to answer a question from a listener on what should a brand do if Hreflang went away. Hey, Bill, how's it going?
I'm good, and you?
Good, good. So I think you just published a post on this, didn't you?
Yes. Yeah, we were trying to answer this question that came from one of the listeners. I think this person had a case where they had deployed Hreflang and it didn't seem like Google was acting quick enough to ingest it and process it. And I've seen a few other people post on LinkedIn, is Hreflang still working? Does Google care about it? And as you and I have talked about many times, there's a lot of SEOs that want to get rid of it because it's hard and all the chaos that often comes with it. So we tried to answer this question. If Hreflang were to go away, what is a brand or a company? What can they do to try to create something that replicates Hreflang? And that's really what the article is talking about that.
Okay, so we've talked about this before, and even in some cases where even if it didn't go away, there are things that people can do to give some scent and maybe help with the ingestion of the hreflang properly.
Yep. And then just to tease an upcoming episode, and then there's a post we just put up today about a recent the Google Search Off the Record podcast. They were talking about duplicate content and canonicals and how they ferret it. And Alan from that team actually talked about hreflang within that context. And it's pretty interesting how he referred to internationalization as really in the form of an iceberg, that there's a small sliver above the surface, and then the rest of it beneath the surface is where all the chaos happens. And it was very interesting in the context of duplicate. He was talking specifically about on the international side is, as a teaser for that, one, they broke it down into cluster. Google's system will find all the documents that look the same, both yours and other people, and they'll put them into what they call a cluster. These are all the things that are exact or nearly exact to each other. And then they apply a secondary process, which is what we know as is sort of canonicalization. Which of these should be applied? And then after that process, he was talking about that they actually they would look at hreflang and say, okay, now we have a language or a location scenario. Of these in the cluster, which should we present? And let me step back because I find that a lot of people forget what the purpose of hreflang even is, right? The first thing that it's doing is obviously it's putting an explicit statement to the language and the market. The syntax is technically the region, but I think the word region confuses a lot of people because people think, oh yeah, I make it for Latin America or it's a market. Let's just keep our lives simple.
North America.
And Google's, yeah, exactly. And Google's adopted that region because that's what the nomenclature, states. So, but I've asked them, can we just normalize this? Because nobody except the tech geeks writing, stuff for W3C and those other organizations use, technical things like this. So anyways, really what it's doing is it's sending first and foremost that language and market statement that you have. And then two, it's saying these other pages are alternates of this page. And that's the key piece, right? Because if you have, and I always like to talk about our friends at Nike, 37 English language pages, and the only thing that designates them from each other is they're in a folder that's a country and or a language, and they're using hreflang. to state that. Or maybe there's a currency. I think 20 of them have a different currency symbol. Other than that, they're all exactly the same. So how does Google sort it out? How does it know this is your Australian one? How does this, because Australia uses the dollar symbol just like the US. Canada uses the dollar symbol. And so in this article, we tried to explain, these really what used to be the signals that you would use before you had hreflang. So if Google doesn't have hreflang, let's go old school and look at some of these signals. And so let me bring up my notes here. When we wrote this article, we broke them into 3 clusters. And you and I had this conversation about how we might put these into groups. Number 1, we said these are why not actions, or you should be doing them actions. However, I couldn't come up with a cool way of giving it a cool name. But these are things that you should be doing. The one that we've talked about in the past is the HTML lang tag. And it's interesting, if people look back, and I meant to put in the episode number, what we talked about when Gary from Google had asked, what are some other ways we can handle the same? How can we do hreflang without hreflang?
Yeah.
Right. And one of the arguments people had was, well, what about using the required tag, the HTML lang tag? And we beat that to death in our conversation at that point, because many CMSs or web platforms actually hardwire this. So it's not adjustable. And even Google was talking about this, that in their research, many websites, and I've seen this, like if you download WordPress in France, and even if you make it an English language page for the United States, it still keeps the lang tag of FRFR. And then, I took a couple examples out of the article, but I was looking at Logitech and their international or rest of the world page. Even though it was in English, they were using a tag of ESAS. Why, I have no idea.
Oh, okay. That's good. So
Spanish and AS is, American Samoa. And so a lot of people will tag that as like ASEAN, but AS. Anyways, that's what it is. So I think the research that I did 7 or 8 years ago, non-US websites, this was wrong about 85% of the time. So again, let's get this right. This is a tag, unless you have one of these dorky CMSs that hardwire this variable, make sure it's correct.
Yeah.
Now, I'm going to say this with a really, really big caveat. So in that internationalization podcast that Google did, they explicitly said, and have said at least 3 other times, they don't even look at the HTML lang tag.
Google doesn't.
Google doesn't.
Yeah, I've heard that.
Things may do it, but from what I understand, they really don't give it much weight. But Google doesn't look at it. So, Bill, why are you telling us to get it correct? Well, that's a signal that they could fall back on.
Yeah.
Imagine if everybody got their shit together and did the basics correct, maybe Google would use it.
And there's other search engines.
And there's other search engines, exactly.
Especially if you're international.
So that's number 1, right? Let's get that correct. Number 2, we talked about, getting language and cultural nuance. So, change the things that are location specific. There's British English, there's American English, there's, Australian English. Do those localization things for that market. Canadian French versus France French. Integrate that in there. And then, use local specific words. And I think a lot of people often talk about this, like soccer and football. Americans, it's football. And everybody else clarifies that as American football. And, and then football is ubiquitous to soccer. And so the one I see people talk about is in American, we might call them soccer cleats. And, in the rest of the world, they're either football boots or, football shoes, because, there. So get those terminologies, correct. An interesting thing, I remember working on a project with Dell where the localization team came back and they had used the German word projector for like an LCD projector. And we showed them that there was maybe 50 searches for
It's
that because everybody
Beamer.
was using Beamer,
Right. Beamer, yeah.
right? And then the American in the room is like, well, that's a car. Well, it's only a car to an American.
Right.
And so we've got all these either colloquial names or we've got, things. So get those things in there.
Hmm.
Again, the other big one that you're a huge fan of is, getting internal linking, cross-site linking, making sure all that's wired. It's really interesting how many companies, and I've not been able to figure out why, and what is the rationale other than UX people saying, get that out of the way, is the country and language selector. It used to always be at the top. It used to always have a
Yeah.
globe. Maybe it had the ubiquitous American flag for English, unless you were a British company, you would dare never to do that. And then it sort of got relegated to the footer because God forbid anybody would land on the wrong page. And then now there's a lot of people that have gotten rid of it completely, especially people using IP detection. And then the third one is I see a lot of people now using a search. When you click that, it brings up a search box. And then you have to either start typing the country or the language. Now, search
Oh, I
engines
haven't seen
can't get
that.
into this.
I was just going to say that's not a link.
It's not a link.
Yeah.
It's a search function,
Right. Right.
which they can't get into because
Yeah.
until you put in something and hit enter, there is no response. It's not a pull down. It's not an action menu. It's not a modal. It's nothing that can be scraped.
Yeah. There was a time when, and it's still even today, you don't know what page, you don't know what site you're on. Like how many people actually look at the URL bar and where you're talking about having some indication at the top. I think, an anchor text with the word in it is probably the best right next to if it's a country specific flag. So, you could say German, German, if there's more than one German language.
Right. And then, even if you just have the globe, when you pick it up, then you let people pick and choose. A lot of people now, a lot of e-commerce sites will tell you pick the language and then pick the currency. And then they're using like either a Java or some other, dynamic insertion to change everything to accommodate that. But
Hmm.
but have that signal. Now, if you've got the old school country language selector where you click it, it pops up, or if you go to the FedEx homepage, you have to pick the country, you have to pick the language, and then
Menu.
based on that,
Yeah.
you go into that gateway. And what's nice about that is, at least at a homepage level, you've created these relationships.
Yeah.
And especially if you've got a site where, you've got a root domain that uses IP detection and you've got a gazillion backlinks. Like I looked at one the other day. The homepage, mycompany.com, was ranking in about 15 countries. And the SEO is like, that page doesn't even exist. You can't get to that page because there's a 302 to the IP detection that takes you to the market. And I said, well, guess what? We put that into Majestic and it said there was like 57 million backlinks to it.
Yeah. Yeah. And
And I go
it's a
ahead.
302, so it's holding it in its memory.
It's holding it in its memory. And here's an SEO that's like, oh, I didn't realize that. It's
Hmm.
like because it was there back in the day and you did a 302, so it's still there. And because of all the equity that's pointing to it, guess what? We looked at out of 27 markets, 25, when you click the logo, it went to that version of the page. And then we went
Wow.
into to press releases. And we went to 5 markets. And the press release, the reference to their company in every market we looked at, it said mycompany.com and it was a link to a page that technically doesn't exist. We had to get around that using setting that to the X default, and it fixed it fairly quickly. But the point is, if Google's not aware of these interrelationships and that magical high value page can't cascade value down, you're losing a lot of opportunity. So having a language selector, making it detectable, creating these linkages between markets, I think is critical. And
Yeah.
even if you've used one of these funky search functionality that you probably paid a fortune for, talk to the UX team to see about at least putting this in the footer.
Yeah.
Another one. So let's go back to our backlinks, our gazillion backlinks to that magical homepage. Do we have links to this? And it's a test that I've always told people to do is every other week, look at who's linking, especially if you have one of these magical root homepages that has a 302 redirect, who's linking to it? Because if you can do that, find these links to that page, or let's say people, even your own PR press release goes out for the UK and they didn't update it to change it to the UK website. It's going back to maybe the US or the global site. Getting those changed are links that should be going to the correct market. So, and then it's interesting how many people don't generate backlinks to the new market or to a market. It's a very interesting thing. It was sort of in this duplicate. There was a passing reference, and I've heard Google talk about this as signals. I think this may have been the article, Bill, that we were trying to think of, a news article to talk about, where there was some reference somewhere to, can you deploy a new product and that product be indexed and be considered valuable if there's no chatter on the rest of the web?
Yeah.
And we've talked about this, how can you launch something and it be newsworthy and not have a single mention in social media?
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And
Yeah.
this
And
is one way.
Google's trying to figure out who were the real companies, and if no one's using your company name as a destination search, or no one's creating links back to it, it's
Right.
tough. It's really tough.
Right. And I think it may have been something you sent me from Corey that was talking about this as well. Does anybody else on the web think, you're of any value? And that's really what we're getting to. And so, making sure that you've got local PR campaigns, make sure that they're using local references to the pages, make sure that any references that should be local but going to global, are redirect or reset to those. So that was interesting step. Again, remember, these are all the must-have, should-do
Yeah.
type things. Another big one that we're seeing a lot of discussion about. In fact, I was trying to watch some of the news from there's actually a Google Webmaster meetup in Zurich that I was trying to go to, but because I'm heading to Asia next week, I just couldn't make it work. But they were talking about a lot more organizational schema that they're trying to implement.
I was gonna say you can use a web page in language schema setting. So you can say like
Mhm.
US as a in language for the
Exactly. And so in the article, we have 3 bullet points and then a variety, and we actually credit, I think it's Ziggy Strotsberg. He was one of the people that wrote a really solid blog post about this idea of using, in language and area served. I've amplified that because when I dug into it to see, can we use it, there's also a third one called available language. And this is explicit for events or content. So like performances, those things. But making sure that you've got local business schema, because that includes things like, the local address. And then you get these companies. The one I've gotten recently from someone that said, Bill, we actually don't have a presence in that market. So how can I use local markup? And then when we went to their page, we saw that they were actually using, turned out it was a Google phone number, but it was local. So you can put a local phone number that goes into, the Google, those, I forget what they're called, the Google phone numbers. So put that in. The big one is in your product offer, use price and currency. Because the best thing about that, remember we talked about Nike that's got that dollar symbol, and it's not referenced a US dollar or an AUD or USD or CAD. But what's nice about in product offer schema, it explicitly calls out that, I guess it'd be an acronym, that abbreviation AUD, CAD, USD. So it's an explicit reference to the currency, which gives you a strong signal. And I think those were the main ones, getting your location settings, using the correct terminology, something that indicates location and market in your web page. The second cluster, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, you keep going. You keep
The
going.
second
I
cluster
haven't
we
heard.
called Hail Marys. Go
Okay,
ahead.
so I was going to ask you about, on like site-wide signals you can add that people can see. So like
What would be
name
that you
name
can see?
you could change the name in the, if you have like the company name in the titles, so you can say you can add like US, UK, GB, company name, and then some indication
Mhm.
of what page you're going to be going to. And you can do things like adding the address and phone number right on the page in the footer,
Oh, absolutely.
like that.
And wrap that in schema.
Yeah.
Because again, as we're hearing now, schema, and maybe that was another one of the articles I flagged was somebody was talking about with the AI SEO or AI optimization, getting all of these entities, where Google can make an inference from the entity, what it is. So hold that thought about putting the country or location in the title.
Hmm.
I totally agree with that. So one thing that I've written about that nobody talks about is, I never came up with a cool name for it, but it's like SERP cannibalization where, and I talked about this for a couple projects we worked on with Hreflang Builder in Latin America, where somebody would do a search, like Huawei was one. Somebody would put a Huawei, whatever model phone, and the Argentina page would show up. And people weren't clicking. Even though ranking number one, they weren't clicking into Argentina if you were in Peru. So Peruvians knew it wasn't going to be their currency. It's not what they were looking for. So even though we were ranking number one, we were getting almost no clicks. And then because the page that was ranking was from Argentina. When we deployed hreflang and the Peruvian page, the only thing that changed was now it was Peru, and the headline had the model of the phone number and Peru, because we did exactly what you just instructed people to do. We had that in the page. The people were clicking. So when it was a Peruvian page in Peru, in the search results in Peru, people clicked.
Mm.
When it was an Argentina page in Peru, in the Peruvian search results, people didn't click
Hmm.
because they didn't want to go to Argentina.
Right.
Right. So, one of the things we're seeing people do, and I mentioned this, is if you use IP detection, you may want to remove that country because, especially if you're making a big mistake where you're blocking Google from getting the market that they want, because Google may be able to get to the US, it'll show the US, but when you click, the IP detection takes you to Peru, right? Did I confuse that? So
Yeah.
let me hold off on that. Let me give it in a context that I mean.
Okay.
So the Hail Marys, this we called it Hail Marys because this is the stuff when you're like, okay, what can I do to fix this? And we couch this as, I'm going to read this verbatim. The actions in this section require a bit more resources, including planning, budgeting, and developmental resources. But if you can get them, those resources, it'll go a long way to establishing geo-targeting of the content, right? So that was the big caveat. Number one, server location and speed optimization. So using local hosting. Now, many people are on CDNs, so this is done for you. Meaning when a user comes in from Peru or a user comes in from any other market, the CDN detects that and routes that request. Now, this is the problem I hear some of these wannabe global SEO consultants talk about is they're like, you're using a CDN. So, but what if Google crawls from the US? It's going to route you to a CDN in the US. Therefore, Google's never going to see the CDN in Peru or Australia or Bulgaria or wherever it is. So, this is why people are looking at local hosting where they can give a signal that it's actually local hosting.
Hmm.
So is this one of the things you want to talk about is what signals are you giving? And it's an interesting discussion that it's yet another article I need to post in our Facebook group. I just need to start posting these in Facebook whenever I come across them. At least we have a
Yeah.
place where we can find them.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
I want to remind people of our free Facebook group where we use that as an opportunity to discuss these things, and you can ask any questions you want. You can also suggest ideas for upcoming podcasts. You can find that by searching International Web Mastery Free Group.
but somebody broke this down, and it wasn't in the context of IP, but in terms of security, because now Google's talking about using your headings, setting your headings about caching and that a different way. We'll talk about that in a different one. So, local hosting, using a local host that's serving an IP that this content is in this market. The other big one is
And
we're
the
already seeing
complexity,
this.
but sounds good, but the complexity of that is basically CCTLDs for everything you got. Now you have to
You're
manage.
jumping ahead.
Oh,
You're
sorry.
jumping
Go
ahead.
ahead.
Okay. But you're right. It is complexity. And remember, I put my disclaimer. This
Yeah,
is going to take effort. It's going to take planning. It's going to take money. And remember, this is also in the context of you have no other choice,
right,
right? And
right.
I give my
Yeah, good point.
final caveat at the end, so we're going to save that one because that's the controversial one. But you're right. You just totally nailed it. The two biggies, CCTLDs. We already see a lot of people moving to this. And it's not necessarily for international, but for branding and all the other goodness that people are talking about. So you can go away. And this is a key. This is a problem if you're using a generic top level domain. Now, we covered what, 4 episodes, 5 episodes ago, the research where a couple people had done some research about did it really make a difference, yes or no. Now, I do mention that in the international podcast that Google did, they said if you're on a .de domain, and your content is in English, they don't use the CCTLD of Germany as a factor.
Well,
Because
make
why would you have an
yeah,
English language site on a .de domain?
yeah,
You totally could because you're a German company and you have an English version and you may have a French version. And what about that you happen to do business in Switzerland and you have 4 or 5 of them, right? So these are the crazy stuff that makes our life fun. Consistent and localized URLs. Another post that I think Google had was they inferred on a call, and someone had a really good breakdown of this. I think oh God, who was it? Anyways, they were saying if you make any change to a URL, it is a new URL.
I just saw someone posted something. I think it was recipes.com. They changed their URLs, tanked the site,
Tank the site.
tanked the site.
And this other article that was referencing this Google conversation said, putting a trailing slash, taking a trailing slash off, putting a new hyphenation, adding a new directory, uppercasing to lowercasing, all of these make these new URLs. So all the crazy stuff that people are out there trying to do. Oh my God, I just saw somebody else post, and this is why most days I can't read SEO stuff because it drives me insane. Somebody said, hey, it was in somebody's 2025 predictions that exact match domains are coming back and that we need to go to exact match keyword URLs. Fairly prominent person said this. And so, imagine all the people that are putting in tickets now to start jamming keywords into URLs. So, anyways, it is there. Location based mobile URLs. So I saw somebody else post that they were in the process of undoing all the AMP because Google said they didn't support AMP. But here was another case where they magically, as they were doing this in the middle of unraveling all their AMP, they magically started ranking for all their AMP pages, despite having a robots text and a canonical undoing AMP. Who knows? But anyways, what we're saying is location based content, again going back to schema, and then my business listing and being mobile friendly because again Google's crawling with mobile from there. Provide regional language switching. So again, clear user navigation. So if you didn't get that point in the previous section, I put it back in as a must do. The big one that takes work. Now, we talked about this in our alternatives to Hreflang. And it was a reach because remember the caveats we put in there? There was like 5 caveats of using market-specific product feeds. I'm both a little more bullish on this because it is a big punt. Let's say, and the way my caveat on this was, as Google starts to display more product shopping blocks for commercial and transactional queries, creating market-specific feeds would become a critical activity, increasing the relevance and viability or visibility in search, especially if your local pages do not show in the SERPs. You may not need to worry about these local pages anymore because Google's not showing them.
Right.
Like I just did a query today. So I wanted to clarify duplicate content canonical review of the Google podcast. So much so that I created a totally separate article because that's the way my brain thinks, idiot proofing this for people. And the example I was using for idiot proofing was the brand new shoes that I just bought, where they're not only, well, I'm going to save it. In the article, it's the first time I've not only showed a category page with a bunch of links underneath it, like you get when you search for the homepage, those navigational links.
Site links.
But then also there was 3 product blocks. And so the actual page took up like 3/4 of the real estate, which was awesome for New Balance. And then I actually also defected to ASICS for my normal running shoes. First time I've defected running shoes in like 13 years. But my go-to was the New Balance. Anyways, getting back to this, when I looked at this in 4 markets, above the fold for this model of shoe was these product blocks. And then the New Balance page was like 4 pages deep under reviews of this model of shoe. And Google just announced this week support for the Google market specific product feeds. I think it was 12 new markets. So they're doubling down on product market feeds. Let's go back to our alternative. I'm going to say we because we're in this together. We both put our names on it. But this was my crazy idea. But I like bringing in accomplices to crazy ideas. We doubled down on this idea of GTIN, Global Trade Item Number. So what our prophecy was, how we thought Google to do this, if Google is really doubling down, and I think they support 25 or 26 markets with these market feeds. These products you have to use to be in Google and to be in Amazon, a Global Trade ID number. So that model shoe has a GTIN. So we said, couldn't Google take that GTIN, now note this is the same product, and use this data in the product feed and the fact that we put in a URL, use that URL as an alternative to Hreflang. I'm going to leave that there because we didn't go into this much detail, but the idea was I have a globally recognized ID, and in these 20 some markets that I have local market feeds, I have a URL that's tied to the GTIN. Why can't you use that to show this version of the page in a local market? That's all we said. And this may be one of the things Google's considering. All right, that was a reach. That was us basically saying.
That's a good way to lean into that. So basically you have these feeds first. Once the feeds are all working and they can get that sorted, it's an easy stretch to say we're going to use the same system for local rankings. Yeah, sure.
Why not? We've got a variable that is the same.
Right.
Right? Because we can have an MPA, this manufacturing product number, that can vary, but the GTIN cannot vary. You know, it's like an ISBN for a book. And because that is fixed, and it's not indicative of all the other, you know, size variations and all that other nonsense, it is the product ID. And since that's sort of etched in stone, and these feeds all have a URL for a page where you can purchase it, and in theory, that should be the page that should be ranking, they can easily do this. Our rationale behind that in that other article was people spend a lot of money getting these feeds right. They
Yeah.
hire these specialist firms and spend, I know of people spending tens of thousands of dollars to build these feeds and get them right. Nobody's spending that kind of money to try to get Hreflang right.
Yeah.
Why? We know why, but they will spend a shit ton of money getting stuff that they're spending, I don't know, giga shit ton of money that they're spending on advertising. So that was our theory of why, our rationale of why we recommended this. Okay, so those are, as you eloquently put, require effort, budget, significant commitment on people's side. Okay, so then that leads us into the extreme options. This is where and I'm trying to look. Yeah, I didn't put I need to put in an even stronger. So basically what we said is, however, you may need to implement one or more of these extreme methods for those who cannot or will not make those adjustments, especially keeping your generic TLD set up. So for those of you that are unwilling to move off of that, you're probably going to have to use one of these. Number one, IP location detection. What else are you going to do? It's not going to do anything about the SERPs. And this gets back to your point of, let's put the country in the SERP. Then people are like, oh yeah, that's Argentina. Let's click on it. If we remove it, then who cares what page shows up as long as the snippet's in English. And when they click on it, they're going to get sent to the right market. Let me tell you who cares. If it is Peru that's not showing up, Peru cares because they're on the hook for traffic from organic search. Now, Peru gets the traffic ultimately.
Yeah, I just want to point out and I know where you're going with this. You're talking about the marketer, so not the web visitor.
Yeah, the web visitor just wants to get where they go. The
Right.
fact that you have a gazillion websites, like 119 at FedEx in English that say exactly the same thing in all 117 markets, they want to get to where they want to go. They want to get to where they can transact or where they can learn about it, right? The marketer is on the hook for this. So again, we're now beyond Hail Mary. We're in the world has collapsed. Hreflang is gone. People aren't coming to my market. Business is drying up. I need to do something. Well, we put in IP detection. And I caveat here, if you go this right and are confident Google may not index these. Oh, I specifically say, if you go IP detection and are confident Google may not index these sites because you're a purist and you believe that you can't give Google an override to come into the market, meaning you put an exemption of whatever search engine. If it's a search engine, let them have the page they request.
Yeah, you don't want to be redirecting them.
But again, our what do we call them? Our celebrity international search experts. There are a few that talk about that this is cloaking, but it's not cloaking because we're not bait and switching. We're giving them exactly. When you apply IP detection to an engine, you are cloaking.
Yeah.
Because you took them from what they asked for and sent them elsewhere. Okay, cool. Anyway, so this is where I say, if you do this and you can't grant an exception to a search engine, you may want to remove the country name from the title tag because people will not click that SERP listing. Right. So we want them to come through. Okay, number 3, remember, these are extreme. Website consolidations. Reduce the number of same language websites that need to be indexed. First, focus on underperforming sites. These are clones without any location-specific information. And those sites that you did simply because you had the localized content, ensure you follow best practices. So that's like, if you can't win, there is no Hreflang, you can't do any of this other stuff, and you're not getting any traffic from organic, consolidate them. The next one was language-only websites. So many companies, and I know of 4 right now, 4 major enterprises that are basically following IBM's lead and are moving to language-only websites. So they're not going to have 27 or 45 English language versions. They're only going to have one English language version. And then they're setting up IP detection to insert lead generation forms and other local specific elements like price.
Yeah.
Anything that's
So,
truly local, they're swapping out because they know your location
so personalization at the
and
location level.
personalization.
Yeah.
Right. Exactly. I like personalization. It's a better phrase. My last one. This is the one that's going to piss people off. Accept it and move on. It may be easier to accept that your redundant content does not have a unique enough value to be indexed and presented to a specific market. Most companies may not want to accept this option, but it may be the only choice without major changes and using one or more of the previous recommendations. And that's
Yeah.
it.
I think that's a lot of the problems that people complain about, especially when they're using tags on the page. And those pages are being called out as duplicate and not being indexed. Now you have four countries indexed, one called out as a duplicate because you had two English, and you've basically broken every hreflang tag across all the sites because
Right.
there's no return.
And in the show notes, I'm actually going to put a link to both the article we're posting today about Google's handling of duplicates and to the actual podcast that they did. Because what you just said is exactly what Google is doing. So when we talked about it originally, clustering, if Google's encountered for, like when I was looking at New Balance, right? Um, they have 21 market pages in English for the 880 shoe, right? So I can
Hmm.
guarantee you, based on what Alan said, all 21 of them, well, there's actually a lot more. There's 21 when you go to the product page, and then there I saw another 21 English markets. And then there was, yeah, so 21 times there was another number I had in the article. So let's say there's a shit ton, like 100 versions of the same page,
Yeah.
where the only thing changed was the color or the size. Now, the nice thing that New Balance did is it canonical all the variations of the same shoe. The
Hmm.
color, the size, the width, those were all canonical to one version, the 880 version page. And that's what Google's saying. Then it's interesting in this article that made a lot of news and prompted John Mueller to say, he jokingly said, the moment that Alan said there's as many as 40 canonical variables that his team uses to distinguish which page is the best of all the pages in that cluster. 40 variables. And so John Mueller joked and said, yeah, I can guarantee you there's SEOs right now firing up a spreadsheet trying to collect those 40 variables and weighting them and extrapolating on them and coming up with weighting craziness. And the number and one of the things that he said was, and if you think about this, right? You've told Google this is an important URL. Number one, in your sitemap.
Hmm.
Number two, because you've linked to it. Number three, because other people have linked to it. Number four, you have a canonical. And like you said, when two URLs are put into the equation, and not to give much away this article, because, yeah, so check out the article, because as anybody that's listened to, what are we on, 18, 19 of these podcasts, know that we think differently than other people. So we often hear and read things differently than other people. There's at least 5 things I call out that Bill agrees with, bringing him in as my accomplice on this, that Google says that I didn't see anybody else comment on. And one of the things that they say, so Alan specifically said, let me talk about it here. The crawl team, which he specifically says is a totally different team from the duplicate team. Now, Bill, remember that crazy chart that I built that I had by PubCon Keynote, where I had these steps that Google is
Yeah.
taking?
Basically, the systems
That
to how to.
validated 3 of my steps,
Yeah. Yeah. Like
right? So,
every 2 or 3 months, there's another step validated.
yes. And they give a teaser step in here, which is really cool that nobody talked about. But So I guess we're breaking some news that was broke by Google themselves. But so number one, he's saying, here's a really cool one. The crawl team, if they encounter a canonical, they don't immediately follow the canonical if they've never seen that canonical page. That was fascinating. So you come to a page and Google finds a canonical. Remember, the crawl team does not immediately follow things. So this was an interesting, I don't even know what to call it.
So that to me sounds like, if you look at the most basic description, they're just building that list of links.
They said that. They confirmed that. And
Yeah.
this is what set a bunch of the celebrity SEOs in a tizzy because they didn't realize that's what's happening. So
No,
they're compiling a list of links.
Google never crawled links. Google built a database
Never.
of URLs.
Exactly. So they may add that canonical to their database. And guess what they just did? They added one more link, one more page to their list in their cluster. That gets what? This cluster gets handed off to the dupe team. And then the dupe team handles these. But what Alan said is he wished that the crawl team saw the canonical and immediately took an action. Now, what I call out in this article, what did Gary tell us that Hreflang tags do? They trigger an immediate verification. What did he say? It triggers. Oh shit! I didn't bring it up. I wanted to use his words. It triggers a need to go do the verification. So those pages are immediately queued for crawling. It triggers an action. The question is, why doesn't a canonical trigger the same action that Hreflang triggers? Because remember, we were talking about Hreflang. If you launch a new site, a new market, a new set of pages, it was critical to have Hreflang in place at the time of that launch, so Google would immediately go revalidate the clusters.
That makes sense from a system standpoint.
And so Alan calls this out as he's been trying to get the crawl team to do the same. He didn't put the two pieces together. I did.
So why do you think Alan wants that to happen? Because in my mind, if I'm an engine and I land on a page and there's a canonical, meaning I'm linking to another page. Don't look at this page, look at this other page. You would assume that other page is already indexed. I would assume that other page is important. That's probably been around a while.
So I think that's what he's saying. So Alan is very careful in his wording to say, if that canonical tag, the rel canonical tag URL has not been previously crawled.
Right.
If it has been previously crawled, we know something. But if it's not been crawled, they don't immediately crawl it. They queue it.
So here's where I think the rub is. The crawl team is trying to reduce the crawl budget. The dupe team is trying to get the best result without having duplicates. Alan would benefit from knowing it's a duplicate. The crawl team doesn't care that I'm spitting this out my butt here, but the crawl team doesn't care what the canonical is because you've implicitly said there's another page. And
no. They should care. I think that they don't care, but they should care because there is explicitly another page. To them, it's just another URL. Remember, they're fetching URLs.
That's what I mean. So it gets added to the bottom of the list to crawl.
Right.
Yeah.
And but I think Alan's point is, what if that's not been, let me actually put words in his mouth.
Okay.
If that URL's not been seen, it probably should be prioritized.
Yes.
To go fetch.
Definitely from you. My head's starting to hurt, but yeah, I would think that it would be cheaper to know that that was a duplicate,
right,
as soon as possible.
The other thing he did in the podcast that you just did yourself, that I called out, is have a conversation with Googlebot.
Mm-hmm.
So when you were asking your question, you said, if I'm Google and I come here and I see that you have this canonical, that I should say, hey, this is the page. So I called this out in thing. I said, we should have a conversation. And we had this discussion the other day when I was trying to help somebody with their Hreflang, but another consultant told them to canonical everything to the US. And then, so we need to have this conversation. I'm going to use your wording, but put it in what I did. So this is in the article I just wrote. Hey, Google, I'm glad you found my UK page. Because I have it listed in an Hreflang entry, my XML sitemap, and I link to it on my country selector from other UK pages. While I do want it indexed to bring me significant SEO traffic, please, Google, respect my rel canonical tag and do not index the UK page to show it to people. I want you to show the US page instead of the UK page. Thank you.
Why even bother?
Right. So if you had that conversation out loud,
Yeah.
you've effectively sent all these signals. And that was Alan's point, is that the number one thing that I took away from that, other than making sure people understand clustering, which is how we got on this tangent. Clustering is bringing all these exact or nearly exact versions into one bucket and say which one of these is the one I should use.
Hmm.
And then they were saying it is a huge problem for them when they have mismatched signals. So this is a mismatched signal that
Yeah.
when a canonical is pointing, you have a page that you've told it to go fetch, that you want them to do something with, but then when they go there, there are signals sending them elsewhere. No index, redirect, rel canonicals. And then it's especially confusing when they go to the destination you told them to go to. And those signals are either back to where they came from or equally forward moving.
Yeah. I just campaign with two pages and each page canonicalized to the other.
And we see this all the time. And so, in this article, that was one of the things that they said, oh, you got to read it. There's some good shit in here. He talks about marauding black holes. He talks about, their biggest challenge is webmasters not getting signal points correct. It's really good. And they talk about their biggest problem is, conflicting signals from people. So let's wrap this up. We were talking about exactly if Google were to do away with hreflang, we got to go old school, do all the things that we've not been doing as well, because we've had things like, hreflang, making all the signals on the page as strong as possible, to be market centric. And then, some middleware stuff. And then lastly, doing some more severe things, changing to ccTLDs, using IP redirects. And then worst case saying it is what it is, Google, we'll figure this out at some point in time. Any other thoughts on this? I mean, it was a lot. And just to clarify, and in this most recent podcast from Google about duplicates, Alan did say that there's some new changes coming to hreflang, some enhancements. I want to make that clear. They're not doing away with hreflang, as we know. Hopefully they didn't say they were in Zurich today. But as far as I know, and we know, there's no plans to get rid of it. There are discussions about how to improve it. And then there was a statement that there are potentially some new features coming out in the new year to make hreflang better. So it's not going away, but we were, again, trying to answer a viewer's question and encourage people, even if you're using hreflang, to make your market-specific signals as market-specific as you can.
Yeah, I think you did a great job with the article. I just happened to look at it while we were talking now, but you've covered everything I had in my notes. I like the way you've broken it down into effort and severity. And we always say, what's good for me might not be good for you. You have to look at your business model. You have to look at your capacities. You have to look at what it takes to maintain things. When people start talking about, oh, you need separate ccTLDs, that is a nightmare to manage hreflang unless you have a tool like hreflang Builder. And I don't know, is there any other tool that can do that with different domains?
No, there's not a tool on the market. I mean, well, let me put an asterisk on that. If you want to do some pages and you're willing to manually do it, like
Right, but
Aleda
not a
has a
tool.
worksheet, there's not a tool. There's no tool out there. And most CMSs can't do it because once you're on ccTLDs, they're typically different build. I mean, that's why people like gTLDs, .com and folders, because most CMSs can accommodate that. And then especially it's problematic if you're like one of those companies that's on the CMS of the Year Club and have 5 markets on AEM and 10 markets on Commerce Cloud and then 5 of them on Shopify. That's impossible. They can't even bundle it across CMS. So Hreflang Builder is the only way that you can do that with any reasonable sanity.
Right, right. So while we pitch this as what you can do when you don't, if hreflang went away, I think it's a really good idea to implement some of these things today. There's no reason you shouldn't. One thing I think we should think about as a podcast in the future is really drilling down into the local market product feeds. I need to learn more about that. Not SEO specifically, but well, I guess it is SEO specifically. It's e-commerce style SEO. So I think that was a good episode. I want to wrap up. I want to make sure that people follow us on Facebook and LinkedIn. We definitely want to hear from you. If you're enjoying the show, we'd really appreciate it if you take a moment to rate, review the podcast on your favorite platform. And, we do this because we have these conversations and we think it's good to share what we're thinking with other people. And we want more people to help us think about this stuff. And don't forget, we have the International Web Mastery website with all the trainings there, how to build a business case, Hreflang implementation, which is probably the most thorough training on the web and or in person. And Bill and I are always open to discussing your situation and potentially helping you.
Perfect.
All right. Thanks, Bill.
Yep. Thanks.
Hey, this is Bill Scully. I just wanted to let you know that we have a free training course called Demystifying Hreflang. It includes 6 modules and is over an hour long with a quiz at the end of each module. You can find it at internationalwebmastery.com. Hope to see you there.